A voice from the past. First, this intended to be quite casual. Interruptions and questions are welcome at any time. Remember, I can't see you, so if you have a question on a slide, please just jump right in. So, EuroForth 2020, welcome to the Fourth Interest Group excursion in China, 1984. So we're going to meet some of the early opportunities. This is the opportunity to meet some of the early FIG founders and fourth implementers.
Will Baden, Charles Moore.
So we'll introduce the people on this excursion. This was in September of 1984. Here we see on the screen, top left to right, is Chuck Moore and his wife, Min Moore. Then in the blue jacket, Mike Perry, myself in the center, Mrs. Will Baden, Mr. Will Baden, and Marlon Overson, who was the editor of Fourth Dimensions for about 5 years. On the left again is Robert LeQuay, his son, Marguerite Phillips in the red blouse in the center. She was our tour guide. Eric Moore, Chuck and Min's son. And I have to apologize, the gentleman with the beard just before on the left, I do not remember his name. And Alan Furman on the left. On the front row, we see George Stevens, Kim Harris, one of the founders of Fourth Interest Group, the LeQuay daughter, then Henry Laxon, and you'll recognize Laxon and Perry from the Fourth 83 model of Fourth. Then Bob Reiling, who was the event manager for all of the formals conferences that were held. And finally, on the lower right are our tour guides. We were required by the government to be escorted at all times. Also not pictured is Dr. Ting, who accompanied us through Taiwan. So this is the routing. We started at the right on the red line in San Francisco. We went to Japan for a change of planes, then to Taiwan for a conference, then to Hong Kong, to Guangzhou, Shanghai for a conference, Hangzhou, Beijing for a conference, Xi'an, and back to San Francisco. This went from September 25 to October 5 of 1984, a total of 20 days. So here are the themes. This talk is not chronological and is not geographical. It just is built on individual themes of interest. First, with our travel, which we've just seen, the Taiwan Formal Conference will come up next. And then we see people, food, entertainment, touring some of the sites, Xi'an and the Terracotta Warriors, some oddities along the way, a major visit to the Imperial Palace, the Ming Tombs, and we end at the Great Wall. This was a multi-mode travel event. Here we were leaving on Pan Am from San Francisco. Now we see the Moore family, Eric, Min, and Chuck Moore. And again, the gentleman whom I can't remember the name of in the second row back. Then jet boats from Hong Kong to Guangzhou. We took a jet boat up the river. There was a transition halfway up the river when a PRC soldier got on board carrying a 22 pistol. He was our escort up the river to Guangzhou. There's the jet boat up the river and exiting in Guangzhou. We took CAAC to Shanghai. And finally, we were on tour buses most of the time. They were very comfortable. Also, this was our introduction to a Tetra Pak, the orange juice, no refrigeration needed in the tetrahedral containers. The orange drink seemed to be a national drink in China. So here is our major greeting as we arrived in Taiwan. They were very, very hospitable. We were presented with banners. We were presented with souvenirs, desk calendars. They pulled out all the stops for us. It was an absolutely outstanding event. You'll see Dr. Ting on the second from the left. His uncle was an escort for us in China. Dr. Ting was not able to accompany us into mainland China because in those days, if you had a Taiwanese stamp on your passport, you were not eligible to enter China. As a result, we all went to China, we went into Taiwan on a group visa so that all of us did not have to have the Taiwanese stamp on our passport. The major purpose here was a formal conference hosted by the Jiaotung University and the Taiwan Fourth Interest Group. We also spoke at the Jiaotung University in Shanghai, which was unrelated, but from the split of China in 1949, they carried on with the same name. The conference was very, very well organized over 2 days with presentations in English and Chinese translation. Dr. Ting would translate from Chinese to English or English to Chinese. It was very well conducted. All these conferences were well attended. We had around 100 people at each of the 3 cities. Fourth was talked about, of high interest, and yet they had very, very little knowledge of what it was all about. Will Baden was a hero. He always drew a crowd demonstrating, and he presented in Chinese, which he learned specifically for this trip. He would start by greeting in Chinese, and he would get a little murmur. Then he would introduce himself and get a little more interest. And finally, he began the talk in full Chinese to a round of applause. Mike Perry likewise would draw a crowd wherever he attended, and you can see the intense interest that the young folks had there. At one of our talks in Shanghai, astronomers from the Purple Mountain Observatory attended in order to meet Chuck Moore, and then they reported the use of his fourth on the variant 620I as part of their astronomical work. In 1949, the Chinese Revolution drove the Nationalist Party into exile in Taiwan. Here is the tomb of their leader, Chiang Kai-shek. It has a close resemblance to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It is a gigantic structure, 5 or 6 stories tall. In mainland China, we visited the Jiaotung University in Shanghai. This is their entryway and their logo. Again, it was a very well attended presentation. At the universities, we were very gracious with luncheons at the faculty clubs. This event was repeated in Beijing. Here are some of the organizing committee at one of the conferences. Notice the clothing. The locals in Taiwan wore US-style white shirts and slacks. In mainland China, remember this is 1984, the style was still mostly Mao jackets. Here's Kim Harris presenting in Shanghai. Notice the banners, they were presented to us in Taiwan, and we carried them with us to formalize our presentations later. Again, now in Shanghai, Will Baden was the focal point of interest. It was particularly effective because, again, he was speaking Chinese. Now our touring begins in earnest. We see here the 2 local guides at the lower right-hand corner. They were required as essential because essentially no signs were in English, and most importantly, they know the locations of Western-style toilets. Here's Will Baden in one of the many gardens. Chuck Moore, he's reading the daily newspaper. Well, it was the paper of year 1642. Kim Harris is known to be fond of pots, so we enjoyed taking this photograph. And here's a picture of me in the Imperial Palace. Food. We ate very well. Some of it was a mystery, but it's all very good. Bob Riding didn't like rice, so I sat next to him and got a double serving at all meals. Here we are in Hong Kong with Peking duck. And again, more food. And more food. And more food. In Shanghai, we took a day cruise on the Wangpo River through the Shanghai area. This river was dug by human labor about year 200. We see a juggler and a magician. In Xi'an, we attended the Chinese opera. There are some 360 existing based on historical tales. The government resents them because they are presented in dialects which the government discourages. And now the Beijing circus had acrobats, magicians, jugglers, wild animal acts, as was presented in the round. Notice they put up a screen when the wild animal act began. Here's the Beijing Ancient Observatory. It was started in 1442 and had major updates in 1644 with missionary assistance. The earliest such instruments date from the year 1217. This is the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. It was constructed from 1406 to 1420, about the same time as the Imperial Palace. It was renovated in the 1700s. The Ming and Qing emperors would pray here for a good harvest. Workshops. We saw weavers, fan makers. Several of our party bought elaborate rugs, which were shipped back to the US. Most cities we stopped at, we visited shops and workshops. Here a lady is, after the weaving, a lady is going through with a pair of tweezers, pulling out every thread that is in the wrong place. In Beijing, here we see a small part of the Summer Palace from the Qing Embassy and dynasty. It's over 3 square miles in which we see lakes, gardens, and many buildings. Longevity Hill was made of the dirt excavated to make the Kuming Lake. Work was started in 1271 and it was finished in 1764, roughly 500 years later. In 1755, the Qing Empress added the boat. The wooden part burned in 1860 and was replaced by marble. This is called the Boat of Purity and Ease. With some controversy, the money was taken from the Imperial Navy budget because, after all, this is a boat. The city of Xi'an was walled in 1368 to 1398, and the wall was rebuilt about every 200 years. Here we see the corner guardhouse. Now, a protective building was built over the famed terracotta warriors. This is the Mausoleum of the first Qin Empress. It was discovered by farmers digging a well in 1974. We were there just 10 years later. Built in 200 BC, that is 2,200 years ago. It has 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, 520 horses, and many figures of ordinary people, plus thousands of arrows and weapons. It took 700,000 workers in a 40 square mile area to build this. Not only did they have to have the workers, but they had to have the complete infrastructure of food, and they even set up farms to feed the workers while they were building the tomb. It originally had a wooden supports and a reed ceiling with a clay covering. Over time, the roofs collapsed and over a 200-year period, and finally it was covered by 14 feet of soil. Here we see on the left the terracotta warriors. They excavated alternate sections so that part of it is still in the original shape, and then they excavated around the warriors. The warriors' body parts are modular between arms, body, legs, and head. They apparently had assembly lines set up to build these body parts, and then they would be mixed and matched when they were put in place. And they say that no two warriors ever seem to match. On the right-hand side is Marlon Overson, and we see the terracotta warriors are roughly life size. Oddities. Our Xi'an hotel was a maintenance nightmare. Our floor's master water heater had overheated, filling the hall with steam. We found the hotel was only 1 year old. We thought it was 40 years old and declining. The local people apologized because they said, after all, it was built by Russians. We see these roof details and gardens around all of the areas. Very, very common. At the Beijing Zoo, we saw the pandas. There were a number on exhibit, and it was one of the best attended section on the whole trip. In the countryside, we saw many Buddhas carved into mountain gardens. This was a very common sight. And here, another oddity. Scaffolding was not steel as we're used to in this country, as bamboo. So here is about a 6-story building, top to bottom. This is bamboo held together with twine. Bicycle parking lot. This had an attendant.
Nowadays they do that scaffolding with steel, but the same style as they did with bamboo. So when you have nowadays this scaffolding, you need to get close enough to see is it bamboo or steel, because from far away it looks the same.
Yes. Thank you. The bicycle parking lot with an attendant. It cost 2 cents to park your bicycle, and you got a bamboo claim check, and the attendant would by memory know where your bicycle was parked. In China, amazingly, all the license plates are binary. That makes a lot of sense to us as programmers. Well, not really. I was honored by Don Knuth to be included with this photo in one of his papers as a humorous one written on license plates. This is a sign marking a shopping district. The sign reads "Store Ahead" with Kim Harris. It's very fitting for a fourth conference. And here is a local Best Buy computer store with the latest IBM computer. It's my understanding that in today's prices, the cost of that computer was about $30,000. Remember, at that time, the IBM PC was only about 2 years old. Here's another view of our group with our tour guide, Marguerite Phillips, on the right. At Hangzhou, we visited Westlake. Westlake is the equivalent of Niagara Falls in the United States, honeymoon location, and it was memorialized in the willow pattern design plate. Here we see in my photos at the lower right, lower left is called the Broken Bridge. On the right is the zigzag walkway. It's zigzag because they say when the devil is chasing you, he can't make the turns. And then there's a cupola shelter on the top left. Now we reach Tiananmen Square. Here we see the Forbidden City, sometimes called the Imperial Palace. Tiananmen Square was gridded to hold 500,000 people with 1 meter square tiles. The Great Hall of the People is to the right, and the tomb of Mao Zedong is at the left rear. This is an aerial view of the Imperial Palace. It's often called the Forbidden City, or in Chinese, Gugun, which means the Great Within. It was the home of emperors for 500 years. It holds 8,000 rooms, that's 8,000 rooms, 980 buildings, over 180 acres. 1 million workers toiled 14 years in its construction from year 1406 to 1420. It receives 10 to 19 million visitors a year. We enter through the gate, the gate of heavenly peace. The center gate was always closed. It was only open for the emperor. The ordinary people had to use the gates on the right and the left. We enter that heavenly gate, and we see the outer palace. And not surprisingly, we now see the inner palace. And thirdly, we see the emperor's residence. Again, the ramp up the center was used to carry the emperor up on a litter, or a palanquin, as they call it. And again, the ordinary people had to use the stairs on the left and the right. This is a joke. This is a reminder to those old enough to remember America's Disneyland back in the 1950s. They issued tickets A through E for all attractions. And so tourists would come here and everybody wanted to take a picture of that sign that said A ticket only. The turtle. The Imperial Palace serves as a national museum, so there are artifacts such as this everywhere. This was a litter or a cow or a palanquin used to transport imperial people. This certainly was not finished enough to be suitable for the emperor. And here's the imperial throne. 30 miles from Beijing, on the way to the Great Wall, are the 13 Ming tombs, built from 1380 to 1644. 3 of them have been excavated. There's a certain degree of controversy, actually major controversy, because when they were opened, the preservation was not handled at all well, and there was a lot of deterioration. This is an interior view of the reconstruction. There were many, many artifacts, and there's a lot of tombs have been found in Egypt. The artifacts were just jumbled in. They were just masses and masses of items that were inserted and included, found in a jumble. Outside the Ming tombs is the 4-mile Spirit Way with guardian animal statues. Here's a picture of me 40 some years ago. Now our tour expands to the Great Wall. You can see it at the left side. It's the gray line along the ridge line at the left. A closer view. Again, it rambles up and over on the ridge lines. This is the entry gate that David Copperfield used in a television special in 1986. In his television special, he walks through or penetrates the Great Wall. They built a platform on the front side we see and on the back side. And then with one camera shoot, he entered a curtained area on this side. The camera went one sweep up and over, and he came out on the far side. The Great Wall was built begun in 600 BC, and it was completed in 1368. It is 5,500 miles long, and with all branches and mountain ranges and waterways, it's 13,000 miles long. It served actually as barracks, watchtowers, signaling capability, and as a pathway to move troops laterally along the mountains, which would otherwise be impenetrable. This is our final slide as our tourists mount the Great Wall. And another view. We walked several thousand feet past where the tourists normally stop, and you see a lot of the wall was in its original condition, which of course after 2,000 years, the stonework had deteriorated and a lot of it was quite irregular. But for about 2,000 meters on each side of the main entryway, it's in perfect shape. And here's our final view of the group. Starting from the left is Min Moore, Chuck Moore's wife, Gary Furman, Eric Moore, Henry Laxon, then Chuck Moore in a red shirt, Marlon Overson, myself, and Mike Perry on the right in a blue jacket, with the Great Wall framing us to the rear. So this is the final view of our tour with the same slide that we opened with. And here are references for those that are interested. Some of this information appears in Fourth Dimensions, Volume 6, Number 5, and Number 6, both from 1985. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much for this great trip through China. It was most interesting. Are there any questions to Bill from Twitch or from our live viewers right here? If not, I would like to open with the questions. So it seems you were able to create some friendships between China and the US. Were you able to maintain them? How did it work out?
There are 2 levels to that. The interaction with the Taiwanese continues to this day. Quite strong because of Dr. Ting's connection and his friends and family. So Dr. Ting goes back to China, or goes back to Taiwan roughly once a year. He carried on a number of projects, hardware projects and software projects that he would transport back and forth. In mainland China, Fourth was a mystery, and the people were just getting their very, very first introductions to what it was all about. And Dr. Ting had an uncle there who was, again, one of our guides. But we've had no contact with the Chinese folks since then. Also, a number of them kind of local businessmen, entrepreneurs approached us trying to find some way to get involvement between our area, Fourth, and China. But all it was they knew there was an opportunity somewhere in Fourth, but they didn't have the slightest clue about what that opportunity might be. And we had difficulty communicating with them. And also in those days, we're talking 1984, you had Fourth Incorporated and you had Figforth. And so the international opportunity on Fourth was extremely limited. So from Taiwan, we had a great interaction. And from mainland China, it was we left with a big question mark.
We still allow for a couple of more minutes of questions, as we had some technical difficulties in the start. Anybody else wants to ask something? Otherwise, I have a lot of questions about this talk because it got me really interested.
It's a very standard tourist trip through China, and you can get on those trip anytime except during the pandemics, of course, because
yes,
the
but
Chinese
not in
won't let you in.
But not in 1984, because back then I wasn't even born. That's why it's of such much interest for me.
Yes, but the only difference with a standard trip is that when you go to a hotel now, it will not be looked like it is 40 years old and will just.
But this one was built by the Russians, we've heard. So I'm sure.
Yeah, of course.
Well, in those days, you could not travel in China unaccompanied. You were required, as a condition of entry, to be escorted. We did meet one and only once unescorted tourist that was there, which is a young lady with a backpack that was on her own. But
that is
because
you
in those days
you were a group.
And also to be in groups. So they were encouraging the tourism, and everywhere we went, there was intense activity on improvements of the surroundings, the infrastructure, painting buildings, putting up pergolas, decorating, painting. You know, everything that a tourist would see was under intense improvement because they could see a tourist capability coming along.
Okay, and we also have a question from Twitch. Astrobe is wondering if you had any weird experiences coming back to the US. Was it a problem coming back from China back then, or did they look at you in a weird way, or was everything just fine?
No. The travel was totally convenient and smooth. In Taiwan, we had a little bit of American food, and in fact, the formal conference had a formal banquet for us in which the dinner was meatloaf and green beans. And we thought, how interesting. And they said, oh yes, they said, American food is a treat for us.
So, very nice. It must certainly be something different. Mm-hmm.
But all throughout the country, we were 100% local, and that was it. In Shanghai, we're at the Ling Ling Hotel, and it did have an American buffet. So when we got back to America, we landed and got to my hometown about 1 o'clock in the morning. And the first place we went to was a local burger stand for a chili and a hamburger.
Sure. Makes sense after such a long trip. Yes, go ahead, Bernd.
So today you can try the American food in China because it's still a bit different. You can go to McDonald's and you can go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, but it's all adjusted to how the Chinese like it.
Bill, I've got a question, which because maybe I'm a bit too young for this to understand, but if a computer costs 30,000 euros, how would I do Forth if I was interested in it? Am I limited to just doing D charts on paper, or could I go to the university? How would I use it?
That's why it was a dead end. They couldn't. They had at Jiaotung University, if my memory serves me right, they had that one IBM PC computer, and that was it. So that, you know, you talk about time sharing, they really had to time share one computer. And our hobbyist level of building things with processors and memory boards was unheard of. Another quirk on this was that trade between Taiwan and mainland China was essentially, they pretended it didn't happen. It was quote prohibited. So what would happen is they would ship Taiwanese things like hard drives and memory into Hong Kong, and then it would be shipped from Hong Kong to China. And so whenever we saw electronics, people would say, "Oh yes, this is the very latest. It's from Hong Kong." Because as a way I don't know if they knew the difference, but that way they couldn't say. You also could not say Taiwan. The polite way is to say Taiwan province, because it's still a matter of dispute that Taiwan is a renegade province from China. And so we properly, you know, when we referred to what had happened earlier in the trip, we would say Taiwan province.
So Uli, you have your mic open. Do you have a final question for Bill, or is it just circumstantial that is open?
It's a circumstance.
Okay, then Bill, thank you very much again. It was mostly interesting. Let's have another hands of clap or whatever.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Twitch, I'm very sorry I have to restart the stream because Bill is not the only one with technical difficulties. I'm also having some. We will be back in a minute, and I will ask Nick to please prepare your slides in the meantime. So see you soon.